Section 28 of Myths and Legends of the Sioux. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tracy Ann, Myths and Legends of the Sioux by Marie L. Mclaughlin. The Mysterious Butte. A young man was once hunting and came to a steep hill. The east side of the hill suddenly dropped off to a very steep bank. He stood on this bank, and at the base he noticed a small opening. On going down to examine it more closely, he found it was large enough to admit a horse or buffalo. On either side of the door were figures of different animals engraved into the wall. He entered the opening, and there, scattered about on the floor, lay many bracelets, pipes, and many other things of ornament, as though they had been offerings to some great spirit. He passed through this first room, and on entering the second, it was so dark that he could not see his hands before his face. So becoming scared, he hurriedly left the place, and returning home told what he had seen. Upon hearing this, the chief selected 4 of his most daring warriors to go with this young man and investigate and ascertain whether the young man was telling the truth or not. The 5 proceeded to the butte, and at the entrance the young man refused to go inside, as the figures on either side of the entrance had been changed. The 4 entered, and seeing that all in the first chamber was as the young man had told, they went on to the next chamber and found it so dark that they could not see anything. They continued on, however, feeling their way along the walls. They finally found an entrance that was so narrow that they had to squeeze into it sideways. They felt their way around the walls and found another entrance, so low down that they had to crawl on their hands and knees to go through into the next chamber. On entering the last chamber, they found a very sweet odor coming from the opposite direction. Feeling around and crawling on their hands and knees, they discovered a hole in the floor leading downward. From this hole came up the sweet odor. They hurriedly held a council and decided to go no further, but return to the camp and report what they had found. On getting to the first chamber, one of the young men said, "I'm going to take these bracelets to show that we are telling the truth." "No," said the other 3. "This being the abode of some great spirit, you may have some accident befall you for taking what is not yours." "Ah, you fellows are like old women," said he, taking a fine bracelet and encircling his left wrist with it. When they reached the village, they reported what they had seen. The young man exhibited the bracelet to prove that it was the truth they had told. Shortly after this, these 4 young men were out fixing up traps for wolves. They would raise one end of a heavy log and place a stick under, bracing up the log. A large piece of meat was placed about 5 feet away from the log, and this space covered with poles and willows. At the place where the upright stick was put, a hole was left open, large enough to admit the body of a wolf. The wolf, scenting the meat and unable to get at it through the poles and willows, would crowd into the hole, and working his body forward in order to get the meat, would push down the brace, and the log thus released would hold the wolf fast under its weight. The young man with the bracelet was placing his bait under the log when he released the log by knocking down the brace, and the log caught his wrist on which he wore the bracelet. He could not release himself and called loud and long for assistance. His friends, hearing his call, came to his assistance, and on lifting the log found the young man's wrist broken. "Now," said they, "you have been punished for taking the wristlet out of the chamber of the mysterious butte." Some time after this a young man went to the butte and saw engraved on the wall a woman holding in her hand a pole, with which she was holding up a large amount of beef, which had been laid across another pole, which had broken in 2 from the weight of so much meat. He returned to the camp and reported what he had seen. All around the figure he saw marks of buffalo hooves, also marked upon the wall. The next day an enormous herd of buffalo came near to the village, and a great many were killed. The women were busy cutting up and drying the meat. At one camp was more meat than at any other. The woman was hanging meat upon a long tent pole, when the pole broke in 2 and she was obliged to hold the meat up with another pole, just as the young man saw on the mysterious butte. Even after that the Indians paid weekly visits to this butte, and thereon would read the signs that were to govern their plans. This butte was always considered the prophet of the tribe. End of section 28.